So, David, so many of us are we're hearing these political phrases or words about government and politics, like democracy, liberalism, nationalism, and for I think most of us we haven't really thought about this stuff since like our high school civics class. So, you're like a thoughtful person and have studied up on these, so we thought maybe
I
you
hope
could
so.
help us understand what these terms mean. And so,
Right.
one of the ones that gets, I think, really confusing for us is there's the word liberal, but then there's also liberalism, which you write
Right.
around, about in your book. What
Right.
is liberalism?
Yeah. Well, liberalism is actually much broader than the way that it's used rhetorically, and especially in American political debates. It's also used here in Canada, but I think it's probably understood a little bit more broadly than it is in the States. But liberalism, I would say that liberalism is the notion that individuals are sovereign. Individuals are sovereign, and they are the ones that determine the course of their lives. They are the ones that collectively determine the course of their political their political regime. And what it comes down to is that it tends to level out the sheer diversity of human communities that we are embedded in the course of our lives. So every community comes to be seen as a kind of voluntary association that is simply an association of individuals who freely contract together to become part of that for their own self-chosen purposes. So you can go back centuries to people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. John Locke, of course, was hugely influential on Thomas Jefferson as he was writing the Declaration of Independence back in 1776. As a matter of fact, I think from our own standards, we might accuse Thomas Jefferson of having plagiarized John Locke's second treatise on civil government because it's so close to what Locke said. There's a certain understanding that political community comes about because individuals have chosen to associate for political purposes. So the idea that there are certain communities that are simply given to us, that we find ourselves in various communities, family, state, church, and so forth, and that they exist beyond or apart from our wills. That's something that would be completely um, it wouldn't be understood by by the convinced liberal.
And so, liberalism is this idea that maybe distinct from like I'm part of a kingdom or
Yeah,
I'm a feudalism or something like that. It's this idea that of liberty. Maybe is
yeah.
that correct? That we get
That,
this idea of
that's
liberty?
That's right, yeah, and it's a certain kind of liberty. It's individual liberty, So you can talk about nations having liberty. You can talk about a democratic system having liberty, but under liberalism, liberty belongs to the individual, and so everything, any obligation that we owe to some other person or some community to which we have not freely assented, that is seen as being somehow objectionable in the consistent liberal.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. So it's about me and my rights and my freedoms. Everything's
Exactly.
centered around that idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that's liberalism. And we also hear words like conservative or
Right.
conservatism. What is that?
Yeah, conservatism it's not so much a political ideology, although I do treat it as such in my book. It's in some ways it's more of a mood. So it's an attachment to tradition, but of course traditions are going to widely vary from place to place and from time to time. So right, very often we find ourselves not only in North America but elsewhere as well. We find conservatives battling with each other over who is a true conservative. But if you try to find conservative principles, you're going to have a lot of trouble finding them because they exist in multiple forms in different places. So you have fiscal conservatives that are largely concerned about money. You have social conservatives that are that are mostly concerned about such about life issues and sexuality issues. Those would be social conservatives. You have now, more recently, so-called national conservatives who meet in various places, even in Belgium and the United States and England and various places, talking about what it means to be a national conservative. So conservatives are going to differ with each other, and there's going to be different, quite different substance in the conservative vision. And I think this is one of the reasons why conservatives have such a hard time against fighting against liberals and socialists, because the content of the conservative vision is going to change so much. It's like pulling teeth to get people to agree on what the content should be. And as a matter of fact, many people who call themselves conservative, especially in the United States, but increasingly in Canada as well, if you start to question them very carefully as to their principles, it turns out that they adhere to what might be called liberal principles.
So we've got this in America. We've got these two sides, right? The
Yeah. Yes.
progressive left and the
Yes.
conservative right.
Yes. Okay.
So conservatism is conserving something,
That's right.
and what I hear you saying is we are different in what it is we're trying to conserve,
Exactly. That's right.
and
That's
perhaps
right.
progressives maybe have a similar issue when it's like, well, what are we progressing towards?
Exactly. That's right.
And so we have all this infighting within both
Yeah.
conservatism and progressivism.
That's right. Yeah.
Maybe let's tease that out for a minute. So you're in Canada, I'm in America.
Yes. Yes. That's right.
Conservatism means something here or some things
Yes.
here. How might
Right.
it be different in Canada than America from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, historically speaking, conservatives were wanted to uphold the monarchy. You know, Canada is a constitutional monarchy. We have a king, King Charles III. He appears, or he will be appearing on our coins. I haven't received any coins yet with his image on the front, but apparently that will be happening in the near future.
Hmm.
So that's one of the things. The welfare state has more of a conservative feel to it in Canada than it would in the United States, partly because self styled conservatives in the United States tend to be more, tend to hold more to classical liberal principles, the principles of individualism, if you will.
Hmm.
The welfare state has a broader, at least historically speaking, has a broader base of support in Canada amongst liberals and conservatives, and also the Socialist New Democratic Party here in Canada as well, which has never governed the country federally, but it is currently supporting the current Liberal government, and it has governed alone on the provincial level.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds very different than the conservatives I'm used to knowing here in the States.
That's right,
Uh,
yeah. But I will say that I think the American version of conservatism has been more influential in Canada over the last 20 years.
hmm.
So in some respects, I think we are becoming more like the United States with respect to our understanding of political ideologies.
Hmm. And is that a happy thing?
Well,
A
I,
scary
I,
thing? Where
I think it's probably both.
okay,
There are very few trends that happen in any country that could be, you know, um, um, wholly bad or wholly good. So I think
sure.
there are some good things about the United States that I think we have taken on here in Canada. Although I will tell you that in some respects, I think we have rejected some of the best features of the British Constitution.
Hmm.
And taken on some of the worst features of the American Constitution. So we've always been between the United States and Great Britain, but in some
Hmm.
ways we're not in a happy place with respect to that.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Yeah.
So, speaking of America, you talk in your book about democracy,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
that word gets thrown around. We have a
Uh,
political party called the Democrats.
right.
What is democracy?
Well, democracy, classically defined, is the rule of the people. But of course, the people never rule directly, except possibly in a kind of direct democracy, such as you might see in no, I think a couple of the Swiss cantons. We find direct democracy in the use of the referendum or the plebiscite where people are voting directly on an issue. We find that certainly in the state level, on the state level in the United States. In my
Hmm.
home state of Illinois, I was born in the United States. In my home state of Illinois, every so often you will find referenda questions that appear on the ballots. We rarely use referenda here in Canada, and when we do, it's almost always divisive.
Hmm.
There were referenda on conscription during the World Wars here in Canada, and they only exacerbated the divisions between Anglophones and Francophones, between English-speaking Canadians and French-speaking Canadians. So we don't generally have referenda in this country. Switzerland is one country where the referendum is made. Generous use is made of the referendum in Switzerland, also in France as well.
Hmm.
Constitutional change is very likely to be put to the people in the French Republic.
So democracy is direct
Yeah.
rule. So what I hear you saying, like,
Well, yeah,
is that right?
yeah, but the way that it's developed is that it's indirect rule. So
Okay.
representative democracy. So in
Okay.
democracies here in Canada, the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, etc., democratic rule takes place indirectly, and we elect representatives to sit in our various parliamentary bodies, and that's the way the democracy works. And so, one of the things that that we should know from our histories, and I'm not just talking about Canadian history or American history. I'm talking about the larger Western history that goes back some 2,000, maybe 2,500 years, is that most of our political philosophers thought that democracy was a very bad thing.
Hmm.
They thought that democracy meant that the untutored masses, this is in an era before mass education, that having people who ordinary peasants who might be illiterate, having them rule was a very bad thing, and it was a recipe for tyranny over the long term. So Plato and Aristotle and other political philosophers would trace the degeneration of constitutions and say that the best form of government was some kind of aristocracy, which literally means rule of the best, and that democracy was the last stage in the degeneration of a constitution before tyranny
Hmm.
arises.
Hmm.
So democracy was not seen as a very good thing. Plato had a lot of reasons to dislike democracy because it was the democratic assembly in Athens that convicted and executed his mentor Socrates.
Hmm.
So he saw that democracy was a bad thing. Now, the forms of democracy that we have in the Western world, I think, are good forms, but that's because democracy has been tempered in some fashion. So we have what is sometimes called liberal democracy, but I think the better term is constitutional democracy. In other words, the people rule, but their representatives rule, and always under the rule of law.
Hmm.
So the people cannot do anything that they please, but they have to rule under this larger principle of constitutional governance or the rule of law.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say the American founders never intended to establish democracy because they were schooled in the classic political philosophers who believed in something called a mixed constitution. A mixed constitution would have monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements
Hmm.
that were supposed to be balanced, in a very careful balance. This is what the American founders favored. I think we can say the same thing of Canada's founders almost a century later in the 1860s. The House of Representatives would be the democratic body, but there were also institutions that would check the democratic rule of the people.
Hmm.
James Madison never wanted to have a popularly elected president.
Hmm.
He thought that the president ought to be elected by the Congress, and that would prevent a kind of maybe a kind of a Napoleonic figure
Hmm.
sweeping into power. Slightly anachronistic because Napoleon was a little bit later from the American founders, but they certainly lived during that into that era. A Napoleonic figure who would come to power and claim that I have the people behind me and
Hmm.
therefore I can do whatever I want to. So the founders wanted to have a carefully balanced constitution in which you would have democratic, aristocratic, and monarchical elements carefully balanced and leading to a more durable constitution.
So this would be trying to prohibit some kind of
Yeah,
celebrity figure who could just wow a mass group of people to
exactly.
take and maybe for some of us we're thinking
Yeah,
about like World War II where you've got these
yeah,
figures
yeah.
Hitler, Mussolini, who
Right,
just
right.
wowed a good
Yeah,
portion of people.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
And so what I'm hearing you say is that the founders of the American democracy
yeah,
were saying, okay, how do we hold that in check? We got to get
that's
some
right.
people who really understand politics and government. They've
Yeah,
been schooled in this. They're educated. They can have
that's
some
right.
power too.
Yeah,
Um, and even I've heard that like George Washington, there was conversation about what we should call him as the leader
yes.
of what we now call the executive branch. And some
Right,
people
right.
would say like king,
Yes, right.
which for as an American, that's like
I
no
know,
way,
yeah,
we'd never do that.
yeah,
Is that part
yeah,
of that setup that they were
yeah.
trying to wrestle through?
Oh, it was. It very much was. Yeah, and you had like Madison's Virginia plan, which was which he favored. You know, we often think of James Madison as maybe the key architect of the American Constitution, but that's
Mm-hmm.
because he and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay wrote what might be called propaganda sheets, you know,
Okay.
the Federalist
Mm-hmm.
Papers, as we know them nowadays, to try to make a case for the states to come on side of this new constitutional federal republic. You know, but Madison actually got very little of what he wanted out of the negotiations in
Hmm.
1787 that led to the Constitution. So the American Constitution, Americans often think that their founders were geniuses who set up this carefully balanced system that couldn't fail. Not true, and the founders themselves never thought of themselves in those terms.
Hmm.
So you know, if there's any genius in the American Constitution, it lies in Americans themselves who are determined to live under this particular constitutional arrangement. You know, that accepted the rule of law and had
Hmm.
been schooled in self-governance for at least 150 years beforehand, you know, in their colonial assemblies in Maryland and Virginia, New York, and so forth. I discovered in as I was doing genealogical research about 20 years ago that one of my forebears actually was sitting in the Maryland Colonial Assembly in St. Mary's City.
Oh wow.
In the 17th century, you know, a man by the name of Captain Cornelius Howard Sr. And this is on my mother's side. My father's side, I'm Greek, you know,
Okay.
going way back. But on my mother's side, yes, and you know, and it was good to know that one of my ancestors was actually trying to build self government in the American
Hmm.
colonies.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've
yeah,
I've done some genealogical research too. I've tried to figure out where they came across the
yeah,
pond, so to speak.
yeah,
And
right,
most of mine are from Scotland and England, but I've got
yeah,
a handful of lines that were in the
yeah,
1600s, 1700s, and I've
right,
actually been able to visit some of their gravesides.
yes,
And
yeah,
it's so cool to
yeah,
not only think about American history, but also think about
yeah,
how for some of us our families were part of that
yeah,
history.
sure, yeah, absolutely, that's right, yeah,
So thinking about democracy being in America, we talk about where a constitutional democracy is the word you used,
that's
that
right,
we're going to
yes,
submit to this agreed upon set of rules that we're
that's right,
all agreeing
yeah,
to, this
yeah,
contract that we have with each other.
yeah,
And then we made amendments.
yes,
Like we have the documents and then we keep making changes. Is that
yeah.
a feature of constitutional democracy as
It
an
is.
idea?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, you know, here in Canada, there's an expression we use that our Constitution was patriated back in 1982, because prior to that, we had the British North America Act, which was simply an act of the British Parliament. So even though after 1931, with the Statute of Westminster, we were fully authorized to run our own affairs, we had this strange anomaly that for the next half a century, our chief constitutional document was simply an act of the British Parliament.
Mm.
So every time we wanted to amend it, we had to go back to the Parliament in the United Kingdom and have them vote on an amendment. And that changed in 1982. So you know, since that time, but one of the things that held up repatriation of our Constitution is that the federal and provincial governments couldn't agree on a formula for amending the Constitution.
Hmm.
So the a Constitution that cannot be amended will likely become so brittle that it will break at some point.
Hmm.
So you have to have a constitutional document that is changeable in some way. But typically, we need to have a qualified majority to change a constitution. So that's what's provided for in the U.S. Constitution. So it would have to have what 2/3. There's more than one. You could have a new what is it, like a constitutional assembly or a
Hmm.
constitutional convention. I
Congress,
think
yeah.
it's the yeah that's a constitutional convention has a different meaning here in Canada, so I have to be careful how I use that. But presumably Americans could decide to establish another constitutional convention that would be fully authorized to scrap the current document and come up with something new. But for the most part, to change the Constitution requires a series of qualified majorities on the federal and the state levels. And that
Hmm.
explains why the Constitution has been amended very few times over the last 230 years.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
And so that adaptability
yeah,
shows that it's capable of learning about how to
yes,
better itself as a
yeah,
people. And so we're all
yeah,
adhering to this idea. We're all going to submit
yes,
to it, but we also
that's right.
know that there's going to be new challenges that we face or new ways that we come
Exactly.
together. And so it's adaptable based on
That's
the
right.
new needs of
Yes.
the day. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's democracy, which I'm a
Yeah.
part of, and I
Sure.
tend to like it. I think,
Yeah. Right.
but then
Right.
there's also this other thing that you talk about in your book that kind of comes on the global scene after the concept of a democracy and liberalism. That's
Right.
socialism,
Okay. Right.
and here in America, that is a very bad word for some
Yeah.
people. They throw it around as if
Yeah.
it's almost a synonym for like demonic.
That's right. Yeah.
What is socialism?
Well, and I think I would have to disagree with you on that because I think socialism over the last 30 years has become far less of a scare word than it used to be.
Okay.
You could have somebody like Bernie Sanders being a serious contender for the Democratic
Mm,
nomination for
okay.
president, claiming to be a socialist, and he'll get a lot of young people supporting him. So there are people sitting in Congress even today that would call themselves socialists, but unlike most socialists, they're not part of a larger movement. They're very much they're very much loners.
Okay.
I'm a socialist, but it isn't as though there's an actual political party that would support them. Now, there is a socialist party that goes back to the early part of the 20th century, the late 19th century. Their high watermark was the election of 1932.
Mm,
And that's when they got something like, I'm probably wrong in these figures, but something over 1 million votes by Americans. Just after the Depression, the Great Depression
mm,
had started. But socialism, I think it's far less of a scare word now than it was even 30 years ago.
okay.
Part of that, I think, has to do with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and other countries. So some of those bad examples of socialism are pretty much gone.
Okay.
But it is true. I think that socialism, the allure of socialism is an end to poverty, an end to
Mm,
want. And that's why socialism in so many countries in Canada, increasingly, I think, in the United States, certainly in the United Kingdom under the British Labour Party, there's the Social Democratic Party in Germany. Every country, with the exception of the United States, has a socialist party that sends members to the parliamentary chamber, and and that's what they want to do. They want to help the disadvantaged. They want to represent the industrial working class. They want to protect the poor in some fashion. And that's why socialism is so attractive to so many millions of people around the world.
mm. So
Yeah,
if we're thinking about liberalism
right.
as me, my rights, don't impinge on me, what
Yeah,
then is socialism?
yeah.
Is it collectivism? Is it about us instead of me?
Yeah, that's right. And that's what you'll have socialists saying, well, this is about us rather than just me. So they appeal to people's altruistic sentiments.
Mm,
My grandfather was my mother's father was a worked at a General Motors plant, and when I was growing up in Pontiac, Michigan. It's gone now, long gone.
mm,
With so much of the industrial economy in the American Great Lakes states in the Northeast. But he I think he would have called himself a socialist. If he had lived in Canada, he would have voted for the New Democratic Party, which is our Democratic Socialist Party here in Canada. And that's exactly what he would have said. This is not about me, it's about us, looking out for each other. And that's where the allure of socialism comes. Socialism revolves around the notion of collective ownership of property.
okay.
Collective ownership of property. And socialists are not wrong to value collective ownership of property. But as I see it, where they go wrong is assuming that every collective ownership, every corporate entity in which collective ownership is manifested, can be um, gathered into one huge community that will then collectively own everything on everyone's behalf.
Hmm.
So we do have collective ownership. Various corporate uh, um, focuses of ownership. Every company, is
Hmm.
owned by its stockholders in some fashion. Or, when I was growing up, there was a railway that went through my hometown in Illinois called the Chicago and Northwestern, and it said employee owned Chicago and
Hmm.
Northwestern.
Hmm.
That would
Hmm.
be an example of corporate ownership. So, but what socialists want to do, at least those that are involved on the national level, they want to try to gather all of those forms of ownership into a single form.
And so,
Yeah.
for some of us, we're hearing that. What's the difference between like socialism and communism and
Right,
Marxism?
right,
Are those all the
right.
same thing, David?
They are not. No, no. I'm going to leave communism aside for just a
Okay.
moment, but Marxism. Karl Marx wanted to bring about, and he thought this was inevitable, that simply through the class struggle, eventually the proletariat, the industrial working class, by dint of superior numbers, would end up overthrowing the bourgeoisie, the what we might call the middle class, and they would basically end up instituting or establishing a classless society, which would be characterized by this principle: from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.
Hmm.
And that is what he saw communism as being. That was the end game of this class struggle. And he thought that was inevitable. It
Hmm.
wasn't simply a utopia that they would have to build, but he thought that simply through the movement of history, this would come about almost naturally.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, in Marx's vision, if I'm understanding you right, there wouldn't be like this stratification of class,
Not anymore.
wealthy,
No.
poor.
Yeah.
That if a person maybe wasn't able to produce, perhaps through being under resourced or disabled in
Yeah.
some regard, that
Right.
the person who is able to produce more would what
Exactly.
naturally share the resources to create some
That's
sort of
right.
equity across
That's
the
exactly
line.
right. And so this assumed that human nature was malleable, that it could
Mm,
be shaped in various directions. And so this is the huge under the Soviet Union, under Soviet communism from 1917 up until 1991, there was this effort to create a new Soviet man, or a new Soviet person, as it were, who would have different motivations than bourgeois human beings.
hmm, hmm, hmm.
Yeah,
So that's Marxism.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
What's communism?
yeah. Well, communism is supposed to be the end game that Marx believed that history was moving towards.
Okay.
So, characterized by this principle of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. But in the real world, communism, as it was implemented between 1917 and 1991, China is still ostensibly communist, although now I think one would simply have to say it's an autocracy, it's a dictatorship.
Hmm.
Um, it's but communism as it existed in the real world was ended up being very much a tyrannical system, a totalitarian system, because if you think that human beings can be reshaped to conform to to the to the expectations of a particular ideology, then there's nothing out of bounds. A government that's dominated by a particular party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, um, there's nothing out of bounds. It can interfere in the minutest areas of life.
Hmm.
And that's basically totalitarian.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, socialism, communism, Marxism,
Yeah.
as an American, these are usually
Yeah.
derogatory.
Yes,
Like you said,
exactly. Right. Yeah.
socialism has
Yes.
maybe gotten a little bit softer, at least for the conservative,
Right.
politically leaning folks in America.
Yeah.
I think they are still
Oh yeah.
nasty words.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and perhaps some of that comes from the abuses of power that we've seen as those have been
Absolutely.
enacted.
Oh yeah. That's right.
You've used the phrase multiple times, in the real world.
Yeah. That's right. Yes.
So we have these ideas, these political visions,
Yes.
and sometimes they're illusions. Product
Yes.
placement
That's
by
right.
his
Yeah.
book.
Yeah. Well, I think virtually every ideology, even liberalism, has the potential to become totalitarian in some fashion. So it's not just communism. It's not just National Socialism, Nazism, or fascism. It's but nationalism can become totalitarianism. I think even liberal individualism, ironically, can become totalitarian as well.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's something that I've been thinking about more over the last few years. I think there's some of that in the second edition of Political Visions
Yes.
and Illusions, much less so in the first edition, which came out 20 years ago. But yeah,
Say more about that. I
yeah,
engaged your work in the second edition. I think I told you
yes.
I flagged like every fourth page, as you can
Oh,
see.
okay.
Uh,
Yeah,
excellent book, and it
yeah.
really
Thank you
helped
very much.
me. Not only remember my high school civics class,
Yeah,
but also get a better handle on how political ideologies have progressed over time. You do such a great,
that's right. Yeah,
almost like a narrative flow of this
yeah,
begets
that's right.
this, and
Yeah,
socialism kind of comes after
yeah,
liberalism. And but
that's
you
right.
have this chapter, this section on nationalism,
Right.
and that's a word that in America, for most of us, it's new or
Yes.
new-ish.
Right.
We're in our rhythms, we'll say things like "one nation under
Yeah.
God,"
Right.
uh, and by nation, sometimes we mean state or
Yes. Right.
government or
Right.
country,
Yeah.
but we also use nation to talk about. Like we have a football team here, NFL team called the
Yeah.
Raiders. So there's Raider
Okay.
Nation,
Okay.
which
Okay.
is a group of people who like the Raiders.
Yes.
so
Yes.
so we use nation in funny ways.
Yeah.
What is nationalism?
Yes. Yes. Well, the again, there are different definitions of nationalism that are out there. If you are reading somebody like Yoram Hazony, who's an
Mhm.
American Israeli political philosopher, he's one of these national conservatives that I was talking about earlier. For him, nationalism simply means that the world is divided amongst various nation states.
Mhm.
So but the way that I'm using it is that nation comes to be regarded as the as virtually a god.
Hmm.
The example that I would always tell my students, most of whom had seen the 1965 Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, the Sound of Music,
Okay.
and if there's one scene in that in there where Rolf, Liesel and Rolf. Remember Liesel von Trapp is the daughter, the eldest daughter of the of Captain von Trapp, played by Canadian actor Christopher Plummer, and there's one point where Rolf, her uh, presumably her romantic interest comes, and he's very stiff all of a sudden, and he
Hmm.
delivers a telegram to Captain von Trapp telling him that he's being I think he's being summoned to become a naval officer in the German Navy
Hmm.
because Austria has now been taken over by Germany during the Anschluss in 1938, and Liesel is trying to be flirtatious with him, and he's become this stiff, character. He's the nation has now taken the place of an ordinary teenage romantic interest, and
Hmm.
that tells you automatically right there that you're in the grip of a power that's overwhelming ordinary human interests and concerns.
Hmm.
And it's that kind of nationalism that is utterly demonic.
Hmm.
It's idolatrous, the very least.
Hmm.
That's the sort of thing that I think we need to steer clear of.
Do you think, in that
Yeah,
regard, what you're referring to as nationalism in a spiritual sense, or a devotion or allegiance
yeah,
sense,
yeah.
is it similar to empire worship? So thinking about
Oh
Rome and
yeah,
the Roman cult, or the
yeah,
cult of Caesar, do you
yeah.
see parallels between those two?
Yeah, I think they're related to each other. It would be difficult to call the Roman Empire a nation as
Right.
such, but I think that's true. The Roman emperors styled themselves as gods, and everybody was supposed to, you know, pay obeisance to the Roman emperor. And of course, they assumed that all of their conquered peoples were polytheists.
Hmm.
So the Romans were supremely tolerant. They just wanted, okay, add the emperor to your pantheon of gods and make a prayer to him and light incense to him. And of course, Jews and Christians could not do that, and so
Hmm.
they were, this supremely tolerant Roman Empire, could not tolerate monotheists. Now, somehow the Jews were treated as exceptions, but then the Christians come along, and the Romans didn't want to um, extend another exemption to the Christians, and so not all the time throughout the period between the death and resurrection of Christ up until the Emperor
Hmm.
Theodosius, declared that Christianity was the official state religion. The persecution was not constant during that period; it would come and go, and some emperors were more down on the Christians than others. But nevertheless, they saw themselves, we're being tolerant. We just
Hmm.
want you to add the emperor to your pantheon of gods. And why can't you do that little thing? And of
Right.
course, believing Christians couldn't do that. Yeah,
In your mind or understanding, if you and I were Christians in
yeah,
100 Common Era,
yeah,
70 years after the resurrection,
sure.
and our Roman overlords
Yeah,
were forcing us. They're saying, "Hey, you need to worship the God of Caesar." How
that's
much of
right.
that is we need to know that you're politically aligned with us, that you're not
That's
more than like religious devotion? How much
that's
of it
right.
was political allegiance?
Well, they were both very much bound together.
Okay.
Both very much bound together. If you read the beginning of Plato's Republic, for example, Socrates and his friends are coming back from a parade in which there are sacrifices being made to the gods. There's certain kinds of symbolism that comes throughout Plato's Republic. If you were a citizen of Athens, that meant that you worshiped the gods of Athens as well.
Hmm.
So this kind of division between religion and politics, or between church and state, that was completely unknown up until well into the modern era.
Hmm.
So yeah, so for the Romans, if you are loyal to the emperor, that means um, you have to pay him homage. You
Hmm.
have to light incense, maybe even sacrifice an animal to
So,
the Roman emperor. Yeah,
so if you and I are again Christians at that era, all of our neighbors are looking at us saying,
yeah,
"Are you a bad guy? Are you an enemy now because of your
yeah,
faith, or are you still
exactly.
one of us? Do we have
That's
to
right.
treat you like an outsider?"
Yeah,
In America, we have some of these rituals, these
yeah,
cultic
that's right.
practices.
Yeah,
At many of the sports gatherings,
yeah,
there's a moment before the game begins where everyone
yeah,
is invited to stand up
yeah.
and
That's
take
right.
your hat off and place
Yeah,
your hand on your heart as
that's right.
we
Yeah,
sing our national anthem.
that's right.
And if people choose to not do that,
Right.
or kneel, or make some
Right.
sort of other demonstrative posture,
Yeah.
their general feeling is suspicion.
Yes, that's
Why are
right.
you
Yeah.
not falling in line?
Yeah.
Now, we don't call that religious devotion, but it very
No.
much feels like uh, religious
Yeah.
practice.
Well, it can
What do
be.
you think?
I don't. Yeah, I don't think there's anything objectionable to having people sing the national anthem. We have our own national anthem here
Mhm.
in Canada, a little bit more singable than the American anthem because the Star Spangled
Uh,
Banner has too wide a vocal range
oh
for
man,
most ordinary people with ordinary voices. But
the, David, I couldn't agree.
it's
There are thousands
yeah,
of YouTube videos of
yeah.
singers butchering the
Oh,
anthem
oh, I
because
know.
it's
Oh, it's awful. Well, when I was in elementary school, in the early 1960s, we never sang the national anthem. It
okay.
was always "My Country 'Tis of Thee,"
Yeah.
which is set to the tune of "God Save the King," incidentally.
Yep. Hmm.
Or else it was the "America the Beautiful."
Okay. Yeah.
Which and they're both far more singable
Yeah. I love that.
than the Star Spangled Banner. But I mean that's just an aside. It really doesn't have much relevance to what we're talking about here. But there's nothing wrong with singing in the national anthem or paying respect to one's country and its institutions, and I think that's
Hmm.
that's a very good thing. But about 36 years ago, um, a member of my family and I went to church. It wasn't our own church, but it was a church in one of the suburbs of Chicago, one of these mega churches. And it was on the Sunday closest to July 4. And we sat down, we looked at the bulletin. The whole service had been taken over by national hymns and the
Hmm.
Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Believe it or not, at the expense of actual Christian hymns or the
Hmm.
Psalms or whatever they might be singing. Well, we looked at each other and we got up and we walked out of there. And it just was more than I could stomach sitting
Hmm.
through a kind of patriotic. And patriotism is a good thing, but I think that kind of patriotic display in the course of an actual church service that made us
Hmm.
very uncomfortable, and that's the sort of thing that I wouldn't like, don't particularly like to see.
Yeah. I mean, could you
Yeah,
imagine Paul writing to the Corinthian or
yeah,
the Colossian church and saying, "Hey, make sure that on the Roman holidays you honor the emperor and pray to him and offer."
yeah,
I mean, it's. I
yeah,
think you're right that patriotism and nationalism often get conflated, but they are distinctly
yeah,
different in that
yeah. They are.
one.
Yeah,
Why don't you help us talk a little bit about
sure.
understanding nationalism in
Yeah.
contradistinction to patriotism?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think patriotism. It has that word patria, which is fatherland. So let's make a comparison to the love that we have for our own parents.
Mm,
I miss my parents terribly. My mother died in May of this
mm,
year. My father died 3 years ago in 2020. But they're such larger than life figures. And I love them fiercely. And I'm going to I think I'm going to get wet eyes as I'm talking about them here. But I love my parents. I love my birth family. You know, uh, um, I think we can love our country, not just our country, but even our local communities, our neighborhoods. There's a certain love that we have for the communities of which we are part, and that's entirely legitimate.
mhm,
So love of country, however we define country, whether it's the community that's formed by the state, by the political community, whether it's a local community, whether it's an ethnic community. I have Greek. My father was born in Cyprus. Greek was his mother tongue, although he also grew up speaking Turkish and French and English as well. But if you look at a film like My Big Fat Greek Wedding,
mhm.
which is
Right.
I swear that Gus Portokalos was patterned after my dad.
I love
You
that.
give me any word in English, and I give you the Greek root. My father was doing that all the time. When we were growing up. So it's not completely fictional. But I mean, you can even love these kinds of Greek ethnic traditions, or Hungarian or German or
Hmm.
what have you. That's perfectly legitimate. But all of these are loves that are um, that are ultimately subordinate to the love that we have for God.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that Augustine understood particularly well. That virtue, he said, is the right ordering of things loved.
Mm,
And if we love something in God's creation above God Himself, then we are members of the city of this world
mm,
rather than of the city of God. But people who are members of the city of God have rightly ordered their loves. They love God above everything that He has created. But that doesn't mean that we don't love our families. It doesn't mean that we don't love our nations or our political communities or our neighborhoods. It means that we recognize the right ordering of the loves and that we love God above everything else.
So patriotism being almost an extension of family love. I think
I think
C.S.
so.
Lewis in
Yeah,
his book The
yeah,
Four Loves talks about it like
yeah,
that I love my family perhaps
yeah,
more and uniquely
yeah.
than I love your family,
Yes,
but
that's
I
right.
don't
Yeah, yeah.
supremacize them. I don't say, well,
No,
therefore
that's
my
right.
family is somehow better than
Yeah,
yours and should be in
that's
charge of
right. Yeah,
yours. In fact,
yeah,
I
that's right.
expect you to love your family in the same way that I love my
Exactly.
family and
That's
your
right. Yeah,
nation and people the
yeah,
same way I love my people and nation.
yeah. That's right. Yeah,
And I don't need to denigrate yours in order to
yeah.
elevate mine.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And that's what these ideologies that I write about in my book. These kind of proximate loyalties, they don't like them.
Right.
They try to flatten them out as much as
Yes.
possible. There's a lot of confusion in our societies today about marriage as well. Because we
Mm-hmm.
want to see it as simply a voluntary association. The idea that it's a thick institution that has intrinsic characteristics that are given by God Himself. That's the sort of thing that we don't like to think about in our society, in the larger society.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the various ideologies try to iron these things out. Everything is either a voluntary association or is simply a division of the state or the nation or the economic class or what have you. But and this is where in the final chapters of my book I talk about something called pluriformity, the pluriformity of society, to recognize that these communities in which we are embedded, that they're simply different from each other. And that's okay. We should be able to accept that and to recognize things for what they are.
So with nationalism, nation being some identifiable people group, whether that's
Right. Yeah.
religious,
Yeah.
ethnic, political, it could also be. And the
Yeah.
idea of nationalism not only being a veneration of the nation in
That's
some
right.
sort of spiritual way, but
Yeah.
also the demand that my people are in
Yeah.
charge. So when we
Yeah.
think about the state and the
That's right.
nation,
Yeah.
uh, so you have in America this idea of Christian nationalism, and
Yeah.
we
That's
see it
right.
in some other places around the world. But here,
Yeah.
it seems to take on the form of it's predominantly white Protestant
Right.
middle to upper class people as a
Yeah.
nation, as a people group, and that people group needs to be in charge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is
I
that
wonder if this is really not so much middle to upper class as much as to lower to middle class.
well the people
Yeah.
being elevated as the leadership
Oh,
would be in
guys.
that
Okay. Right.
yes, very
Right.
good.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
The folks that
Yeah.
are oftentimes at the rallies that I've been a part of,
Yeah.
blue collar, almost
That's right.
across the board.
That's right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but there's this sentiment of our people,
That's right.
real Americans need to be in
Exactly.
charge.
That's right.
In
Yeah.
and the people who aren't the real
Yeah.
Americans are usually the people who live on the coasts,
Yeah. That's right.
the libs, the wokes, the other,
Yeah.
the communists, the socialists, the Marxists. That's always the other
That's right. Yeah.
in
That's right.
distinction from real Americans.
Yeah.
Is that unique to us, or is that going on like in Canada or anywhere else in the world?
Oh, I think throughout the Western world, I think this sort of thing is happening as well. There have been a number of leaders, um, in Hungary and Poland, Brazil, under Jair Bolsonaro. It's a similar kind of a figure. And I want to be careful because I don't just want to dismiss such people and their concerns because I
Mm-hmm.
think I think they have legitimate concerns. I mentioned my grandfather who was working in this General Motors plant in Pontiac, Michigan. I think there were two at that time. My mother, when she was out of high school, was working for a short period of time for a short-lived automobile company called Kaiser Frazer, which uh, which uh, um, um, which was located in what at that time was the largest building in the world, the former Willow Run bomber plant outside of Detroit. And that's where she was working.
Hmm.
So people even when I was growing up, you had people living in these towns. That South Bend, Indiana. I got
Mm,
my PhD at Notre Dame. South Bend, Indiana. The Studebaker Corporation tended to dominate. There was Bendix, other manufacturing um, firms that left for cheaper labor.
mm,
And so there are people living in these communities, especially in places like Ohio, Indiana, that are really suffering
mm,
because of changes in the economy in which they were left out. And at one time, the Democratic Party was the party of the working man, and
mm,
that's where my grandparents on my mother's side, they were supporters of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and for good reason, because they thought that he was the one who was going to do something to make their lives better. That's not the case with the Democrats anymore. The Democrats now have come to be seen as the party of the white collar workers, the people who
mm,
sit in front of computers all day and work there, and people who, as you said, live on the coast in the large cities and so forth. And their concerns are not so much with the people living in small town Ohio or Indiana or Pennsylvania. And so things have changed quite a bit over the last about maybe two or three generations.
mm,
And,
mm.
and, and I don't want to just dismiss such peoples. I don't want to call them baskets of deplorables,
Right.
as Hillary
That's
Clinton
right.
did, because these are real people. They're created in God's image. They
Yes.
have real, legitimate concerns that need to be addressed politically in some fashion. And unfortunately, neither of the political parties in the United States is doing that adequately.
Mm, yes. And so many of them have very real concerns, very
Hmm.
real pain,
Yeah,
concerns, anxieties, fears,
yeah,
lament of a lost past.
yeah. That's right.
Uh, and many are clinging to nationalism, a religious
They are.
nationalism, Christian nationalism.
That's right.
Is that going to get them what they want?
It will not.
Say more about that.
It will not. No. See, I mean, what happens typically is that people adhere to one ideology. People adhere to one ideology. That ideology proves itself to be. Um, uh, I think we're going to have to stop for one moment
Oh, no,
because
no
the
problem.
phone is ringing on my side. If you could ask the question again,
Yep, I
and then
will.
I just need to unplug this. I usually unplug the phone before I start one of these things, and I neglected to do that, for which I
No problem
apologize.
at all.
So start over again, and then you can splice these together.
Yep. Let me
Okay.
just write down the time. Yep, no
Okay.
problem at all. All right.
Very good.
So, David, there's very real concerns, very real
Yeah.
pain. There's lament of a lost past. There's financial concerns and loss. And many in America, and it seems like around the world, are clinging to a version of nationalism, a religious nationalism, here in America, Christian nationalism. So, there are very real concerns. Is Christian nationalism going to get people what they want?
It will not. And this is typically what happens if people follow an ideology for a while, and then it turns out to be spiritually bankrupt.
Mm,
I think I'm willing to use that term, but it also proves not to work
okay.
because it's based on a misunderstanding of human nature and what human beings are. So once they abandon faith in one ideology, then they tend to follow another one, hoping that things will work out better for them. So they leave liberalism behind. That this classical liberalism, that capitalism, if you want to call that, the market economy hasn't worked for them so well. They leave that behind, and then they want to, okay, we'll try for socialism this time, or we'll try for nationalism. But that doesn't mean that it's going to work for them. And typically, what happens is that it does not work for them,
Hmm.
and it brings other problems along with it that then have to be dealt with by not just governments but by a whole variety of communities and social formations.
Hmm. So, what might be some of the shortcomings of religious nationalism?
Um, it expects things to well, it expects that um, it expects that solutions will come about through some simple mechanism.
Hmm.
Okay, if we just shut out immigrants, then everything will be fine.
Mm,
If we just you know go back to the coal mines and the and bring back coal, then things will be fine again.
hmm.
If we just do this or that or the other thing, um, then things will be fine again. We'll have what our grandparents had in the 1940s and the 1950s.
Hmm.
And of course, that's not going to work. We've moved beyond that.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Would you say that nationalism is usually focused backwards, meaning it's looking backwards on something that it wants to reclaim again?
it possibly, yeah, but not
Okay.
necessarily.
Okay.
So I mean, certainly under National Socialism, under Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, they looked back to the supposedly pure German folk, this
Yeah, the
German
golden
German
era.
people, yeah, golden era, and Mussolini as well could look back
Hmm.
to the Roman Empire and wanted to try to, build a new Mediterranean empire and in
Hmm.
North Africa and East Africa, by conquering Ethiopia and
Hmm.
so forth. But not necessarily, because sometimes nationalists have a view that, wow, we have been. Um, for generations, we have been controlled by foreigners who
Hmm.
don't speak our language, who don't know our ways. We want to be liberated from them, and we will have a glorious future once we are
Hmm.
liberated from
Hmm.
them, and everything will be better after that point. Yeah,
So, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of
yeah,
1980s, the troubles in Ireland,
right.
and this conflict that was happening. Is that a version of like an ethnic nationalism where the Irish are saying, we don't want
Yeah.
your rule, we want to rule ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah, the Ireland situation is complicated by the fact that you have so many um, Protestants living in Northern Ireland who want to
Mm-hmm.
remain part of the United Kingdom. Although, last I heard, they might now be in a slight minority status
Hmm.
relative to Catholics in Northern Ireland. But I've not seen confirmation of that. But I'm I could use maybe Greek nationalism in the 19th
Hmm.
century. There had never been a country called Greece.
Hmm.
That was completely new. The Greek Revolution began in 1821, and then it took another decade before this new kingdom of Greece was recognized by the great powers as being an independent state.
Hmm.
Greece had never existed before. There
Hmm.
was there was the Byzantine Empire, but that was simply the late Roman Empire that happened to be Greek speaking at the time. But Greeks wanted to have a well, they wanted to revive Byzantium, I suppose. That was so
Hmm.
there was looking to the past, but they also thought that if they could gain as much territory at the expense of the declining Ottoman Empire, the things would be a lot better.
Hmm.
And my father's native island of Cyprus was caught up in that as well, because it was in the 1950s, late 1950s, there was a guerrilla war being fought by people who wanted to unite Cyprus with Greece, despite the fact that there were a lot of Turkish Cypriots, maybe about 20% of the island,
Hmm.
some of whom I found through DNA testing are relatives of ours.
Oh,
The
wow.
Greek and Turkish Cypriots are actually related to each other. And
Sure.
you might not get them to admit that, but it is true. We have almost no DNA in common with people living in Greece.
Hmm.
But that's the sort of thing, this ethnic nationalism, about which admittedly I have a blind spot, because this is what led to the division of Cyprus in 1974, just almost half a century ago, and all of my relatives became refugees as a
Hmm.
result of the troubles in 1974 in Cyprus, including my elderly grandparents
Hmm.
who were born in the late 19th century, and had to endure being exiled from their homes for the rest of their lives. So this is why, for when I think of ethnic nationalism in particular, I have an emotional block. It's
Hmm.
it's something that I have difficulty seeing the goodness in,
Hmm.
even though my studies tell me that there is good in everything
Hmm.
in God's
Hmm.
creation, in God's
Hmm.
world.
Hmm.
Even the worst of ideologies have something positive
Hmm.
to contribute.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So, just kind of as we conclude our time, you end your book with some really, really good thinking and articulation of that good thinking in how followers of Jesus can
Yeah.
live in the space that they find themselves in under whichever
Right.
governance or idea. Talk a little
Sure.
bit about, if just for those of us that are listening, where
Yeah.
most of us are Christians living in America,
Yeah. Yeah.
how might scripture, the teachings of Jesus, and the Christian tradition shape our view of how we operate civically in this world?
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I think I towards the end I um, talk about something called pluriformity.
Mm-hmm.
The pluriformity of authorities, or the societal pluriformity, if you will, which simply means that we are embedded in a diverse communities, simultaneously. So
Mm-hmm.
I am at once a member of a particular family. I'm also a citizen of. Happen to be a citizen of two countries, United States and Canada. I'm a husband in a marriage. I'm a father to our daughter. I'm maybe I'm a member of a particular church community as well, downtown Hamilton. We are members of various communities. To keep that before us at all times, and to recognize that we need to respect the integrity of these communities.
Mm-hmm.
So very largely it means to be careful not to fall prey to the promises, the false promises that are given by these ideological visions. Now I have another book that's coming out in November of next year.
Okay.
That yeah the working title is Citizenship Without Illusions. And the
Oh, okay.
illusions in
I like
the
that.
illusions in this title is an allusion to the illusions in the title of the first
Very
book.
good.
So I'm dealing with some of the progressive and the conservative polarity, and
Mm-hmm.
some of these other things as to how we can be good citizens in our particular polities, recognizing, if our vision has been clarified by recognizing the false promises that these ideologies offer us, then how then do we live? How do we live as disciples of Jesus Christ in the world in our respective polities? So that's going to happen. Um, you'll find out about this next November when this next book comes out.
Oh, that's great. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah,
So, David, where can people find you and your work?
yeah. They can. I have a blog called Notes from a Byzantine Rite Calvinist, and it's on Blogger. You can find it very very easily. If you just put in my name, David Koyzis, Koyzis, or ZIS if you're American, you'll find me very very easily, and you'll find a whole lot of things. You'll find connections to the books that I've written. You'll find my blog. You can find me on Facebook. I'm on Facebook as well. I have an authors page that you can like. I'm pretty close to the 5,000 limit that Mark Zuckerberg and company have imposed on
Mm,
people on Facebook, but you can find me nonetheless and follow me. And yeah, I'm pretty easy to find.
very good. Well,
Okay.
David Koizis, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.